Some 2 miles southwest of Aldwark, along the old straight road that splits the county in two, lies the village of Fernbank. Dating back to Saxon or perhaps even Roman times, these days the village has expanded far beyond its original boundaries to fill a broad strip of land on the ridge between the road and the river floodplain. The village has lost much of its character as a result of the expansion and is now little different to hundreds of similar settlements across the shires which have fallen victim to ever-growing populations of newcomers with scant knowledge of country ways and country life. There are other ways in which Fernbank resembled other communities across England, for there was a man, a poor description, but it will have to suffice for the purposes of this narrative, a man who went by the name of Bobby Grayling. There is a Bobby Grayling in every parish in England. They may not look the same, may bear no external resemblance to each other whatsoever, but in nature, mannerisms, and downright crookedness, all these men, for they are invariably male, are brothers in everything but name. Normally there is never more than one of these malignant creatures in a village, no community being able to survive with more than a single such drain on its physical and mental well-being. In Fernbank, Bobby Grayling was the sickness that sapped the strength of the community. Grayling did not work. At least he undertook no sort of paid employment like his neighbours. He had decided very early in life that work was, to quote him when he was being less than circumspect, a mug's game. So these days Grayling was unfit for work as a result of a minor accident many years earlier, which had caused such irreparable damage to his back as to make it impossible for him to hold down a job. Or that was what he claimed, and, as is the manner in this day and age, his claims were certified by a doctor too busy to pay real attention, and more concerned for people with real injuries and illnesses than for one man who just wanted to get one over on the system. And so his career-ending injuries were accepted without question by the authorities, certified with a note in a file and set in stone forevermore. Of course, suggestions were made for light forms of work away from the factory floor, but he could easily deflect such suggestions with a few carefully placed medical conditions. Manual work was right out, as his back would never take the strain. The same applied to any office work that required him to sit for any great length of time, as that made his back go into spasm. Walking was agreeable, but not when carrying anything. He ensured that, whilst making the most heartfelt declarations of his wish to earn his keep, he was seen as such a burden to any prospective employer that he was assured of never finding a real job. And so in the end the authorities admitted defeat, though in truth they'd never really tried very hard to avoid the decision. Bobby was signed off on permanent sick leave and received a generous payment from his former employers and a healthy pension from the state, and all before he'd even completed his 4th decade of life. After a year or so of doing nothing very much and generally enjoying life, Grayling found the money from his employer was starting to run low, and the pension, generous as it was nowhere near enough to keep his family in the manner in which they would like to become accustomed. As a result, he looked around for something he could do that would provide a little bit of extra money on the side, but would not involve anything too strenuous. By chance, a cousin had recently acquired a metal detector, which, considering the force with which it must have hit the ground when it fell off the back of the lorry, was in remarkably good condition. A touch of gentle persuasion, combined with the payment of a small fee, ensured that the instrument was quickly acquired by Grayling, and he embarked on his new career as a treasure hunter. Grayling now became a particularly low form of pond life in the deep, wide pool that is archaeology. He was driven by one thing and one thing alone, the prospect of finding something valuable enough that he might make a few pounds, or, even better, a few £1,000s, from a sale to a private collector. It was theft in everything but name, and as such was immensely attractive. So, over the next few years, this man whose injuries prevented him from undertaking any form of manual labour was to be seen in the fields all over the parish and beyond, digging away in search of buried treasure. This poor invalid, who could carry nothing more than a cup of tea, was to be seen on a warm summer's evening striding proudly across the fields, bearing a weighty pack filled to the brim with pot, stone and metal to be examined later in the safety of his home. This cripple, who could not sit for more than a few minutes without his back going into painful spasm, could be found, hour after hour, at his desk poring over some tiny scrap of bronze buckle or a medieval coin, cleaning and preparing to ensure he got the very best of prices from the select group of collectors who he hoped to tempt into discreet visits to his home to purchase the rare and beautiful items he'd found in the fields around Aldwark. Nor was Grayling restricted to simply combing the open fields in the hope of a chance discovery. Early in his newfound career, he had realised that, if he really wanted to make some money, he needed to be searching in those places known to have been of importance centuries earlier. The prehistoric burial mounds, Roman villas and forts, Saxon cemeteries and deserted medieval villages. These were the places that would yield the best rewards for the least work. These were the places that Bobby and his metal detector needed to visit. Unfortunately for Grayling, such sites are of value to more than just treasure hunters. Centuries of neglect and hunting by gentlemen antiquarians had led the government to pass laws protecting these places from the worst ravages of greed and well-meant but incompetent archaeological research. Designated as historic monuments, most of the really interesting sites were now legally out of bounds to Grayling and his faithful detector. Not, of course, that he intended to let that stop him for a minute. It just meant that he had to carry out most of his detecting under the cover of darkness or poor weather. Fog was a positive blessing. It may have made his task a little less enjoyable at times, but if he was lucky, the rewards might compensate for any temporary discomfort. And so it was that Bobby Grayling became that most disreputable of practitioners in an already tarnished hobby, a nighthawk. It heartened the author to report that, in his new vocation, Bobby Grayling was a notable failure. Assisted by his cousin Ronnie, a congenital idiot whose opposing thumb and upright stance mistakenly led people to assume the presence of some form of human intelligence, in less than a year he was able to strip the parish of Fernbank of anything resembling archaeological heritage. To an archaeologist, what he found was almost priceless, but to Bobby it was little better than garbage. Bits of pot, bones and the occasional coin. The sort of thing that might sell for a few pounds but would never be enough to make a living out of. Still, he was nothing if not persistent. Once Fernbank had been pillaged, it was a natural step to move further afield and start scouring the adjacent parishes up and down the old Roman road. There were plenty of sites for anyone with the right tools and sufficient lack of moral rectitude, but a trove of any real value always managed to elude the Nighthawk. Crime, it seemed, just would not pay. And so, as time went by and Bobby failed to dig up his fortune, his thoughts began to turn to the one site he had always sworn that he would never touch. It was a site that had particularly fascinated and haunted Grayling for many a year, even before he had discovered his true vocation as a grave robber. As a boy, he'd been afraid of little in the village. He was, after all, a consummate bully and a sneak, and had always maintained a coterie of associates, I hesitate to call them friends, willing to watch his back, for a suitable price, of course. But there had been one thing that the associates could not protect him from, one fear that had been with him for as long as he could remember, and that was undiminished by time or adulthood. A place that both attracted and repelled him in equal measure, and which lay close by in the adjacent parish of Stokes. Upon leaving the southwestern fringes of Fernbank, the old straight road cuts across an area of low marshy land close by the river. The location makes the riverside meadows prone to regular flooding during the months of autumn and winter, and the waters regularly lap against the raised bank of the road, which acts in the manner of a dyke, protecting the fields and villages behind from the worst of the winter inundation. Only on the rarest of occasions, in the most severe of seasons, have the waters overwhelmed the road to bring misery to the hamlets beyond. On the far side of the marshes, the road passes through the ancient village of Stokes, which sits upon a sandy ridge close by the site of a Roman fort at Pontus Niger. Unlike its neighbouring villages, Stokes has escaped the worst of the development that has afflicted the rest of the district, and even today remains a compact settlement with all the benefits of a shire hamlet. This quiet village, disturbed only by the incessant growl of traffic negotiating the curves and bends that curl past the local pub, enters our story as the home of one of Grayling's uncles, now long dead, but pertinent to this tale, as it was to his house that young Bobby was forced to walk every Friday evening, while his parents drank themselves into oblivion at Fernbank's Riverside Inn. The house and the uncle were both unremarkable. Actually, that's unfair to the man, who was the one good thing in Grayling's wretched life and who did all in his power to deflect the boy from his inevitable slide into indolence and crime. But for the sake of this tale, further description of either the uncle or his residence are unnecessary. What is of note for our story is the field to the south of the road, just as it rose up onto the bank and entered the village. For in this field was a mound, some 50 feet in diameter, and perhaps 10 feet in height above the rest of the pasture. Known locally as the Gallows Grave, it was this mound and the field it occupied that formed the focus for all Bobby Grayling's greatest fears and nightmares. Every Friday night he would make the 1.5 mile walk from Fernbank, down the footpath to meet the road at the edge of the marshes, and then along the verge, across the low ground until he came in sight of the ridge and the first lights of the houses of the Stokes village. In the middle of the year, this could be a pleasant enough walk. In the days of his youth, there were few cars on the road, and none of the great lorries which now made walking the route so hazardous. On a warm summer's evening, the prospect of fishing with his uncle in the river below the old hall, or wandering through the woods behind the water meadows, was enough to suck him along the marshes, in mood of excited anticipation. But as the year drew to a close, and the evenings grew dark before he had even finished his lessons, he came to loathe that walk along the old Roman road. With few cars and no street lights, the trip became a stumble through the darkness, struggling to avoid the potholes and pitfalls in the roadside. As often as not, wind whipped off the open fields to the north, across the river, driving rain, sleet or snow with them. However much he might plead, whatever the weather, and however unwell he might be, Grayling's parents always insisted that he make that walk across the marshes to his uncle's house, while they adjourned to the fireside at the inn. Truth be told, Bobby could cope with the darkness, the weather and the cold. They were annoyances to be endured, but would do little lasting harm, and there was always the prospect of hot toast and Ovaltine once he reached the warmth of his uncle's house. But before he reached that haven, there was one hurdle that had to be overcome, one terror that had to be faced every Friday evening, alone and in the dark. Bobby Grayling had to walk past the field containing the Gallows Grave. If you'd asked him why that particular feature in that particular field should evoke such terror, young Grayling would probably have cited little more than deep-seated but apparently unfounded feelings of unease, and repeated the common local legends about the place. It undoubtedly possessed a dark and unsettling history, having for many years been the site of the gallows upon which the highwaymen and other ne'er-do-wells were hung after a short and usually biased trial at the local hall. In the 18th century, the 4th Earl of Stokes, one John Lovell, had earned the appellation of Gibbet John, as a result of the number of men he'd successfully prosecuted for robbery, assault, or just plain indolence on the Aldwark Turnpike. All had ended their days hanging from the beam on the Gallows Grave, in the process providing the mound with both its name and its bloody reputation. Gibbet John himself had disappeared in mysterious circumstances in that very field one foggy winter's night in 1784, and no trace of his body had ever been discovered. After his death, the mound had been used as the site for a post mill, taking advantage of the bitter winds that swept up onto the ridge from the marshes. But it was reputed an accursed place, and after only a few years the mill was lost in a fire, the miller escaping with his life, but nothing more. After that, the mound had been left well alone, and even successive generations of farmers refused to plough across that part of the field, leaving it instead as a circle of pasture on which the livestock refused to feed. Grayling knew the stories well enough, and also the rumours of strange noises that drifted out of the field on misty nights when, in spite of the lack of wind, a creaking could be heard coming from the direction of the mound, like a wooden beam straining under the weight of a swinging corpse. And so, every Friday evening, Bobby Grayling would approach the bottom of the rise in darkness, steeling himself ready for the mad rush up the hill, past the field and into the village, not stopping or looking back until he reached the safety of his uncle's door. Grayling had never forgotten those fearful winter walks. Even now, more than 30 years later, the thought of the Gallows Grave was still enough to produce dark moods and darker dreams. For this reason, the parish of Stokes had remained mercilessly free of the ravages of metal detectors. Within the parish boundaries, there were many protected sites, including the Roman fort, the medieval remains of what had once, before the terrible plagues of the 14th century, been a far more substantial village, and even a battlefield where the King of England once put his rebellious subjects to the sword by the thousand. In spite of all of this, Grayling had steered well clear of Stokes and its blood-soaked mound.